So what I start with this morning is what my students have become familiar with as a crackpot analogy. If you imagine Stephen Hawking shows up to try out for the Golden State Warriors and he wants to play point guard. Well, that's kind of a crazy mental picture, but then imagine that the coach, and I don't follow basketball, so I have no clue who that is, takes leave of his senses and actually hires Stephen Hawking and makes him the starting point guard for the Golden State Warriors. Well, what you would need to do at that point is either you would need to override that decision and get him out of there, or you would have to redefine what the game was. But the game would not work as it had been played up until that point, with a man with no background in basketball and who has ALS and is in a powered wheelchair as the point guard. The least productive response of all would be if all the players went out to play the game the way it had always been played and then just expressed bafflement and dismay at the fact that, hey, once again, we have Stephen Hawking for our point guard and we're trying to play the game. If you redefine the game, then maybe you could accomplish something. But if you stick with the old game and someone who very, very plainly can't play that role, then you're at a standstill. And I get that the number of people geographically distributed according to the rules going into the 2016 presidential election selected Donald Trump to be the head of the executive branch of the United States federal government. But what has to happen as a result of that is we either have to redefine the game in some fundamental ways, or we have got to neutralize the effect of that decision and have someone else actually occupy the leadership role of the executive branch. But what that role requires, he is not equipped to give. And I don't say that as an attack either on him or on the people who voted for him. But I don't think there's really much room to disagree that what that role calls for is for people to understand complex problems and to make decisions very, very carefully, keeping in mind that hundreds of millions of people and all sorts of values, from aesthetic values to cash values to safety and security values, all of that is at stake on a mind-bogglingly large scale. And Donald Trump, he has abilities, he has successes, he has accomplishments. There are contexts and environments where he thrives, but making very careful decisions through very thorough examination of all the data, that is just not the role that he is cut out to occupy. So that then got me to thinking about this game itself and how it would need to be redefined. And the game itself, electing governing officials, goes all the way back, not just centuries, I guess, goes back several hundred years. Well, I mean, you could say that it went back even further. It went back to ancient times, to the earliest democracies, to Athens and the citizens being able to vote. It went back to what it was like to live under an absolute monarch or some other kind of absolute dictator and to wish that you had a voice in government. And so the innovation was to rethink government and to arrive at an arrangement, at an understanding of government that everybody could cast a vote, everybody could participate, and the government needed to be done by the consent of those who govern. Well, the thing about games is that they wear out. And the thing about institutional and political arrangements is they are a response to their moment in history, but things continue to change. I mean, that's the argument that I would make about the Second Amendment. That's a discussion that I think I could have with someone who disagreed with me, and we could understand one another, and we could have it in a civil fashion. But last summer, when I gave a talk to the arriving first years and transfers who'd showed up to sign up for their classes, one of the things I pointed out was we call 18-year-olds adults because a little over 100 years ago, it was codified into law that at 18, you were an adult. And back when that law was written, 18-year-olds genuinely did function as adults. It was very common for 18-year-olds to get married, for 18-year-olds to go out and work a 40-hour-a-week job, and from that job, be able to earn a good enough living that they could buy a house and they could raise a family. 2017 is different, and that definition of adulthood as beginning at 18, it just doesn't serve us anymore. And I wonder sometimes, I think the way that we respond to a problem that for most of the world went away a long time ago, of there being no voice in government, I wonder if that response, if we've held on to it too long and we have not rethought and thought about what are the actual bottlenecks to functional conduct of our public affairs as it exists in 2017, not as it existed, a couple of thousand years ago. One of the thoughts that just sort of crossed my mind is we had monarchs around the world, and for the most part they were absolute monarchs, but slowly most of them shaded into constitutional monarchs. In the constitutional monarch, take the royal family in Great Britain, for example, at one point, their whim was the law, and they were above the law. But as that government transitioned into a parliamentary democracy with a constitutional monarch, the actual power went to the elected representatives, and where the power had previously been with the monarch's role is now largely ceremonial. Now, that is a form of power. And the royal family, by speaking out, they can actually work some changes in public opinion. It's not as straightforward as when they could just issue royal decrees and those were the law of the land. But it's different power. In some sense, it may be less power. In other senses, in the age of mass media, it might be more power, because even the royal family's ability to issue decrees, back when those decrees had to be delivered across the country and methods of transportation were primitive and methods of communication were primitive, their effective power might not have been as large as we might like to think conceptually if they were absolute monarchs. I mean, you only ever have any power if the people who are supposed to be governed by you actually accept that you have that power, or if you have available force that can back it up. Democracy, as it was understood, and as it continues to be talked about, although I question how firm this understanding is anymore, said that power was supposed to go in the collective, tallied voice of those who vote. But I think it's probably fair to say in 2017 that the vote more has the status of the constitutional monarch. It's ceremonial. And it is, in some sense, feedback to the centers of wealth, to the corporations, to the few wealthy families who actually have all the material essence of power, who actually have all the dollars, who actually have all the, not just money, but other forms of wealth, who have ownership rights over land, who have factories, the ability to manufacture goods, products that bring them in, continuing wealth. The ones who have that, for some reasons, maybe indirect reasons, they do pay attention to movements of mass public opinion. So the vote has a ceremonial function, but it's not the direct form of power that it was originally supposed to be in the system. Of course, it's questionable whether it ever was or whether that was always mythical. The point is, and I know I'm not the first person to question whether democracy is actually what we idealize it to be, or whether it's a cynical exercise to paper over the real decision-making that goes on behind the scenes. These are not original thoughts at all. They're just thoughts that are on my mind this morning. But it just seems as though maybe what we ought to be learning from all of this is that we are hanging on to thoughts that served us at the time. We are hanging on to institutional arrangements that served us at the time, and it's unclear that they do anymore. There was a Supreme Court decision this term. I wish I had looked up the name of it before I hit record this morning, but it was the one about gerrymandering. There are a number of mathematicians who have taken up the challenge that Anthony Kennedy gave a number of years back. He said the Supreme Court is never going to get involved in challenges to gerrymandered electoral districts unless someone can come come up with a says, this district is unacceptably gerrymandered, this district, on the other hand, is acceptable, and that standard has to be objective. It can't be, we are of a political faction and we don't like it because we lost. Well, some mathematicians actually said that there are some reasonably simple formulas. They can be explained in a few sentences that can say some meaningful things about whether there is a fair allotment of votes in a district, or whether a district was created for no other purpose than to neutralize the votes of one political group. And this all came to the Supreme Court, and in the oral argument in this case, the Chief Justice, John Roberts, spoke up right after the formula had been explained and said, well, to me, this is all sociological gobbledygook. And I had this moment where I thought, well, John, are you saying that you just don't like it as much as your legal gobbledygook? Because the idea of democracy in its earlier stages, several dozen centuries ago, it was based on what we thought of as elegant, philosophical formulations. Not necessarily based on data, not based on things that were measurable, but based on principles that when we heard them, we found those principles appealing. I can give an example. I was talking a little while ago about 18-year-olds and how 18 is not really what 18 was a century ago. Well, the vote was not actually set at 18 until I believe I was actually alive at the time. It was around 1970 by, I forget which amendment it was to the Constitution. But the argument that 18-year-olds should be able to vote went this way. If you're old enough to die for your country, in other words, if you're old enough to be drafted into the military, and the Vietnam War was raging at the time, then you're old enough to be able to cast your vote. The leaders who send you off to war should have to face you in the election. And that is an elegant, principled, philosophical argument. And that's the kind of thing that John Roberts would not have called sociological gobbledygook. But I think the premise there may be flawed. What we're able to do in 2017 that they were not able to do back when we had a calendar test for adulthood is today we are in a much better position, maybe not a perfect position, but getting closer and closer to it, to determine whether people's brains are fully online yet. And we know now that young adults continue to develop their frontal lobe, continue to develop the higher learning executive function capacity. That continues to deploy up until around the mid-20s, up until around age 25. And I remember years and years ago, this happened when I was in college. It was one of the last years that I participated in intercollegiate debate. The topic included Supreme Court decisions about privacy law. So, of course, we had a lot of debates about Roe versus Wade and abortion. And what the Supreme Court did to avoid sociological gobbledygook is they took an elegant, philosophical proposition. They said it takes 9 months to have a baby, so we'll divide it into trimesters, 3 months, 3 months, 3 months. And in the first 3 months, the woman's right to choose an abortion may not be restricted. In the last 3 months, the state has a compelling interest in protecting the unborn. And in the 3 months in the middle, the second trimester, that's where states can experiment with regulating the decision to get an abortion. Well, I mean, in some sense you hear that and you say, yes, I follow that reasoning. That puts my doubts at ease. But today we're able to measure things. And so one of the arguments that Harvard actually included this in their particular set of arguments, their case about abortion, and they said that brain birth, when the brain is sufficiently developed that the functions are online that would make you a full human being, that is the point at which it should be permissible to outlaw abortion. And today, we are able to measure that. In 1973, we weren't. And today, we are able to measure adulthood a lot more intelligently. And in 1787, or in the early 1900s, when so many laws were passed that said 18-year-olds were adults, back then, we didn't have the ability to measure such things. I mean, it just feels to me like trying to send a rocket to the moon by looking up at the moon with the naked eye and doing single-digit arithmetic just because once upon a time, those were the best tools we had. Well, we have better tools now, so we should use them. The other thing I got to thinking about how do you change the incentives so that people who are newly entered into the voting pool actually want to vote? I know that Abraham Lincoln, when he was a young man, he was part of the Lyceum movement. And one of the things that young men would do, because it was a way to advance yourself both in your community and in your career, is they would go to Lyceum organizations and they would talk about current events and they would practice giving persuasive speeches about current events. And to be rhetorically skilled and eloquent was the kind of thing that it established you in the community. If people knew that you were eloquent, it won respect and it opened doors for you. And in 2017, it doesn't as much. In 2017, I would say if you have an online presence, if you have creativity and design skills, that might be the analog to this. But how could we translate those incentives, that drive that people have to fit in, to advance themselves, how could we connect that up with participation in public life? And that's really kind of a tricky one. One of the thoughts that crossed my mind that I don't think would work, but it was a thought on the way to maybe one that would work, was maybe you just withhold emancipation from young people until they meaningfully participate in public life in one of several measured ways. So, until you meaningfully participate in public life, your parents are still in charge of you. And it doesn't matter if you're 18, if you're 21, if you're 35, if you've never participated in public life, then you are still a child. You have not emerged from being under your parents' decision-making if you haven't shown that you can fit your decisions in with the people around you. So, that could mean that you meaningfully participate in an election. So maybe what that means is you have to pick one issue that forms part of the choice for one office that's on the slate, and you have to answer 4 or 5 questions about that issue, and then you have to state your position on that issue. And it doesn't have to be good or bad, it just has to be relevant to the issue. You've had a thought that is motivating you to take a position on that, and if you can pass that test, then you have meaningfully participated. Now, there are all kinds of problems with an arrangement that would do that. We're still operating under the shadow of the literacy codes, the literacy tests that governed voting and filtered out any non-white voters for much of the 20th century. But we have the technology now to where participation, having your franchise validated, could be done through blind review. There could be a reviewer who was just checking to see, did you state a position that was relevant to the issue? And if you did that, then you were meaningfully participating in an election, and therefore the government, the community would treat you as someone who was emancipated from your parents, and your parents didn't get to make decisions for you. And it occurs to me that there might be other ways that you could show that you were engaged in public life. And there could be forms of community service that if you went and did them, you could still opt out of voting. I know that there are religious denominations who don't vote in elections, but they could serve in the community in other ways. And then, in the eyes of the law, they would be independent of their parents. And there are all kinds of problems with this, but it just seems as though there's got to be a way to change the incentives that we have to where people actually do want to take part and give their feedback and do something about how dysfunctional our public life has become and how thin our community connective tissue has become. One of the things that you got to be careful of if you impose any kind of pressure, if you use any kind of coercion to try to get people participating, is that some people will make a mockery of it just to be oppositional. And I know I've read on a dozen or more occasions, and in Australia, you have to participate in the election, but have to is defined as if you don't vote in the election, then they issue you a fine. So you could just pay the fine. If you're one of those denominations that doesn't want to take part in elections, maybe they have an exemption for that. But if not, you could just pay the fine. But I also know that in Australia, there are a fair number of people who will vote for intentionally absurd candidates. They'll write in Bugs Bunny. They'll do something like that just to show that I don't like being pushed around and no one's going to push me around. But what that got me to thinking about was, where we have a consensus that something is too important, we don't accept that kind of oppositional behavior. And the example that I thought of is that we don't accept it when it comes to parenting children. We have certain minimum standards of acceptable care of a child, and we enforce them. And much of the enforcement, I would say, is informal. Much of the enforcement is through behavior, through interaction. We reinforce norms, but we also have legal recourse if someone's behavior with their child is so reckless that the child is endangered. And so I think this is an idea that's not very practical and it is shot through with problems. But if we ever were to understand that people's involvement in their community was at least as important for the proper functioning of the entire social order and also for the full satisfaction and positive adjustment of each individual as taking care of your kids, and I think an argument could be made that that's true, then maybe what we ought to do is we ought to think about both through informal enforcement of norms and maybe through some legal systems as well to make the analogy between taking care of your community and taking care of your child. We do not allow people just to be oppositional to opt out of what's minimally acceptable. We enforce it. And of course the problem with turning into a crank and saying, well, maybe democracy is not the best thing after all. There's the old Winston Churchill quip, it's actually really bad. It's just all the other alternatives are worse. But it does seem to me as though history is littered with moments where we understood that what we had done all along, we had continued to do it just because nobody had thought of anything better. And sometimes what it takes to get to the point of thinking of something better is to realize that what you're stuck in, the rut that you're stuck in, has become so dysfunctional that you can't turn a blind eye to it anymore. And there has been so much sort of helpless hand-wringing over participation in the elections leading up to 2016 that when the election produces an outcome like Stephen Hawking as the point guard for the Golden State Warriors, maybe that should be what lights a fire under us to think really laterally and really creatively about should we be responding to today's imperatives, not the imperatives of several centuries ago, in a way that's better suited to the problems we face today.